Imagine this. The world is silent. No cities, no palaces, no kings. Just endless plains of dust and wild rivers twisting through the earth. No stone towers reach the sky. No temples hum with prayer. No law, no order, only survival. But then something begins to stir. In a narrow strip of land caught between two mighty rivers, humans take their first daring step into history. Here, the Tigris and the Euphrates carve a cradle of life out of the wilderness. And in this cradle, the very idea of civilization is born. Close your eyes and picture it. The smell of wet mud after the river floods, the cries of herders calling their animals, the flicker of firelight against reed huts. This is not just a story about the past. It is the story of the first cities mankind ever built. And it all began where the rivers shaped the world. We call this place Mesopotamia, a Greek word that simply means the land between rivers. But long before the Greeks, long before anyone thought to write down names, this land was already alive. The Tigris flowed fast and dangerous, with a temper that could destroy whole villages in a single flood. The Euphrates, wide and slower, carried life-giving water deep into the plains. Together they turned a harsh desert into a land that could grow grain, feed herds, and support something no one had seen before: permanent settlements. For thousands of years, people everywhere wandered as hunters and gatherers. But here, the rivers whispered a new idea. Stay, build, plant. Watch the earth give back more than you take. Imagine being one of those first settlers. You and your family arrive. At the edge of the river, the sun beats down. The air smells of reeds and wet soil, and the banks are alive with fish and birds. You take a sharp stick and push seeds into the mud. Days later, green shoots rise like magic. Soon you learn the rhythm of the rivers, the floods, the droughts, the seasons of planting and harvest. You weave reeds into huts. You carve canals in two. The earth with nothing but your bare hands and stone tools. And for the first time in history, you don't need to pack your belongings and chase after herds. You can stay. This small decision changes everything. It is the beginning of farming. And farming is the spark that sets civilization ablaze. At first, life is simple. Small villages of mud brick houses cluster along the banks. Farmers grow barley and wheat. Shepherds herd goats and sheep. Children splash in the shallows while mothers grind grain into bread. But soon, villages swell with people. The rivers allow them to grow more food than they need. And extra food means trade. Trade brings strangers. Strangers bring ideas. Villages grow into towns. Towns grow into cities. And then something remarkable happens. These cities begin to demand more than survival. They demand organization. Picture the chaos of a flood. The river bursts its banks, drowning fields. Farmers shout. Families flee, harvests are ruined. Someone must decide, where do we build the canals? Who digs them? Who protects the harvest when raiders appear? From this chaos rises leadership. Some are chosen as chiefs, others as priests. They claim the favor of the gods, and with that favor comes power. Slowly, the first governments take shape, not written constitutions or parliaments, but voices of authority who command and organize. And so the city begins to breathe, not just as a collection of huts and people, but as a living system held together by rules, belief, and shared survival. Close your eyes again. Can you hear it? The bleating of goats, the rush of water through irrigation channels, the hammering of stone on stone. Somewhere a woman sings as she bakes bread. Children laugh and chase each other through narrow alleys. But beyond these simple sounds, there are new ones, strange ones. the pounding of clay tablets being pressed with cymbals, the chanting of priests before rising temples, the clang of copper tools sharper than anything stone could shape. These are the sounds of a revolution. In human life, the invention of writing, the rise of religion, the birth of technology, and all of it begins in cities born beside the rivers. At the heart of every early city stood a temple, a ziggurat towering high like a mountain built from mud brick, where priests claimed to speak with the gods. The people believed the rivers, the harvest, the rains, all were gifts from divine powers. To please those gods, offerings were made, sheep were sacrificed, bread was burned, prayers were lifted. The temple was not just a place of worship. It was the center of power, the bank, the granary, the heart of the city. If you lived in these times, the temple loomed over you every day, reminding you that your life was tied to the will of unseen forces. But progress always carries a price. As cities grew, so did their hunger. More land, more water, more workers. Irrigation systems stretched across the plains, binding villages together under larger and larger city-states. And with growth came rivalry. Neighbors eyed each other's canals. Who controls the water controls life itself. Conflict brewed. Spears were sharpened. For the first time, humans fought not just to survive, but to conquer. Still, despite the blood and struggle, the rivers continued to shape. They gave enough for cities to rise, fall, and rise again. And each generation left something behind: ruins, stories, myths that whispered of the first brave steps into civilization. So why do we remember this place? Why does the story of Mesopotamia matter thousands of years later? Because everything we take for granted, today's cities, governments, writing, trade, law, it all began here. The rivers did more than shape the land. They shaped us. They turned wandering tribes into builders, dreamers, storytellers. They turned mud into bricks, symbols into writing, chaos into order. Every time you walk down a city street, every time you read a book, every time you obey a law, you are living with the legacy of those first riverside settlers. And so, the story of civilization begins not with kings or empires, but with rivers and the people who learned to live beside them. From mud huts and simple fields, the world's first cities rose like sparks in the night. But this is only the beginning, for in the next chapter, those cities will grow taller, louder, and more powerful. Temples will rise, kings will claim thrones, and myths will echo across the desert winds. The rivers gave birth to cities. The next step will give birth to kingdoms. Close your eyes and imagine a city around 3000 BCE. The streets are narrow, twisting like a maze. The air smells of smoke and roasted grain. Merchants shout from stalls filled with baskets of dates and jars of oil. Children run barefoot through the dust, chasing each other past walls painted with bright pigments. But above this daily bustle, something else dominates the skyline. A temple rising tier by tier, built from mud bricks stacked so high it feels like a man-made mountain. This is a ziggurat, the stairway between earth and the heavens. And just below it, in a hall heavy with incense and echoing chants, priests call upon the gods. The city is alive, but it is also ordered, every step watched by unseen eyes. Every life bound by both kings and the divine. But kings did not rule alone. At their side stood the temples. Temples in Mesopotamia were more than places of worship. They were centers of life. They stored the city's grain, managed its trade, and even crafted the earliest forms of accounting. On clay tablets, scribes scratched symbols that tracked sheep, oil, and silver offerings. In many ways, the temple was the beating heart of the city, half holy, half practical, fully essential dot step inside one of these temples in your mind. The cool darkness swallows you. The air is thick with the smell of burning incense. Statues of gods stare with inlaid eyes of shell and lapis lazuli, their gaze both haunting and eternal. Around you, priests murmur prayers, their voices rising like smoke toward the high ceiling. For the people, this was proof that their lives were not small or forgotten. They lived in the shadow of gods who demanded respect, obedience, and devotion. Asterisk. Why did temples matter so much? Because life in Mesopotamia was fragile. The rivers flooded unpredictably. Crops failed, disease spread. Enemies attacked from beyond. The walls. The people feared that behind every disaster was a god who had grown angry. To survive, they needed to please these divine powers. The temple was their shield. Priests were their negotiators. Every offering, every ritual, every sacrifice was a plea. Spare us, protect us, guide us. Faith, fear, and survival were inseparable. The temple promised order in a world that seemed ruled by chaos. Asterisk. But here is the twist. Kings and temples needed each other. Yet they were rivals for power. Kings commanded soldiers and built walls. Temples commanded gods and controlled wealth. A clever king could claim divine favor, but without the priests, his word was empty. A powerful temple could demand obedience, but without the king's soldiers, its riches could be stolen. This fragile balance gave rise to stories of rivalry and ambition. Some kings built massive temples to show their piety. Others stripped temples of their treasure to fund wars. In Mesopotamia, politics was never just politics. It was always laced with the sacred. Asterisk. From this world of kings and temples emerged stories, myths that carried truth wrapped in legend. The most famous of them is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, part man, part divine, a king so powerful that even the gods grew wary. His adventures told of love, friendship, arrogance, and the haunting search for immortality. But these myths were not mere entertainment. They were lessons. They taught people that kings must balance strength with wisdom, that the gods' will was beyond human reach, and that even the mightiest ruler must one day face death. Through stories, the line between kings and gods blurred. Even more, history and myth became one. Asterisk. By now, the first cities were no longer just clusters of homes, they were symbols. Their walls promised safety. Their temples promised divine favor. Their kings promised order. For people who had once wandered the earth with no roots, this was nothing short of a miracle. But this miracle also demanded loyalty. Farmers labored in the fields, not for themselves alone, but for the city. Soldiers died not for their families alone, but for the king. The city demanded sacrifice, and in return, it gave identity. This was the beginning of something we still feel today, belonging to something larger than ourselves. Asterisk. Yet beneath this glory, shadows grew. Kings hungered for more land. Priests guarded their wealth. Cities fought each other for water and trade. Already, cracks began to appear. The rivers that gave life could also bring destruction. And the kings who claimed divine favor were often no more than men driven by ambition. Still, for a moment in history, the dawn of kings and temples shone like firelight against the dark. Asterisk. And so, the world's first kings carved their names into clay, and the world's first temples rose toward the heavens. Together they shaped the earliest blueprint of civilization, one built on faith, power, and the constant struggle between them. But this was only the beginning. For soon, cities would not just worship gods and serve kings. They would invent something even more powerful, writing itself. And with writing, memory would no longer fade with time. The next chapter is the story of symbols pressed into clay, of stories that never die, the birth of writing, and the first attempt to capture eternity. The story of Mesopotamia now moves into a moment that changed human history forever. Imagine a world where memory fades as quickly as words leave the tongue, where stories vanish when the storyteller dies, where trade depends on trust alone because nothing can be recorded. That world was about to end because in the land of Sumer, people began pressing signs into wet clay, and for the first time in history, words would remain even after the voice was gone. The Sumerians, the people of southern Mesopotamia, were masters of turning mud into miracles. They had already built canals that cut across the land like veins, carrying water to their fields. They had raised cities with walls so thick that enemies broke their spears against them. They had crowned kings who claimed the blessing of the gods. But their greatest invention did not stand tall like a ziggurat or gleam like copper. It was small, fragile, and could fit in the palm of a hand. A clay tablet. Picture a scribe sitting, cross-legged in the dust outside a temple. The sun burns overhead, but he is focused, holding a reed stylus between his fingers. Before him lies a soft clay tablet. With slow, careful movements, he presses wedge-shaped marks into the surface. Each mark is a symbol. Each symbol carries meaning. When he is finished, the tablet will record the delivery of barley to the temple granary. It will outlast the harvest, outlast the scribe, perhaps even outlast the city itself. The Sumerians had no word yet for what they created, but we call it writing. At first, writing was not poetry or myth. It was survival. Farmers needed to know how much grain they had stored. Priests needed to track offerings to the gods. Merchants needed to record who owed silver, who had delivered wool, who had promised oil. Before writing, memory and honesty were the only tools. With writing, numbers became eternal. A mark on clay could not forget. A symbol did not lie. But the Sumerians were dreamers, and soon those symbols grew beyond numbers. They began to carve signs for names, for places, for prayers. They pressed into clay the words of kings boasting of battles, the hymns of priests praising the gods, the contracts of merchants sealing trade. For the first time, thoughts were captured like insects. In amber, trapped forever for future eyes to see. Close your eyes and listen. Can you hear it? The scratching of reeds against clay, the murmur of scribes in crowded workshops, the steady clatter of drying tablets stacked like bricks in a temple archive. Imagine walking into one of these archives. You pass rows of shelves filled with hundreds, thousands of tablets, each one a voice from the past. Here is the account of a shepherd who delivered 10 sheep. Here is the list of workers assigned to dig a canal. Here is a hymn to Inanna, the goddess of love and war. A library is born in clay, but writing was not for everyone. It was a power guarded carefully. To become a scribe was to join an elite. Boys were sent to tablet houses, schools where they learned to press signs again and again, until their hands ached and their tablets shattered in frustration. They memorized hundreds of symbols, copied long lists, recited them aloud. Discipline was harsh, mistakes punished. Yet for those who mastered the craft, rewards awaited. Scribes stood at the side of kings. They managed the wealth of temples. They carried the memory of the city on their tablets. To write was to hold power. From this fragile invention flowed wonders. One day a scribe pressed into clay the first known law codes, rules that declared how disputes should be settled and how justice should be measured. No longer could a ruler change his word on a whim. The law, once written, stood above him. Another day, a poet shaped into words the great story of Gilgamesh, a tale of friendship, loss, and the search for immortality. This story, born in Uruk, would survive thousands of years, copied and recopied, whispered into the ears of kings and peasants alike. Without writing, Gilgamesh would have faded like smoke. With writing, his legend became eternal. Think about this. Every story you have ever read, every book you have ever opened, every word you see on a page today, its ancestor lies in those first wedge marks pressed into clay. The Sumerians unlocked not just the ability to record, but the ability to imagine across time. A farmer could speak to the future. A king could address generations not yet born. A poet could whisper to ears thousands of years away. Yet writing was not only a gift, it was also a weapon. A king could carve his victories into stone and erase his defeats by silence. A temple could inscribe debts that bound farmers for life. Those who controlled writing controlled truth itself, and in Mesopotamia truth became clay. Still, the people were awed by this miracle. They believed writing itself was a divine gift, bestowed by the goddess Nisaba, patroness of wisdom and scribes. Her symbol was the stylus, and her temples were filled with tablets covered in tiny marks. To the Sumerians, every sign pressed into clay was not just a human act, but a sacred one. Now imagine standing in Ur, one of the great Sumerian cities. The sun sets over the ziggurat, casting long shadows. Priests chant in the temple courts. Merchants haggle in the markets. And in a quiet chamber lit by oil lamps, scribes bend over their tablets, capturing the heartbeat of the city in clay. Outside, life is fleeting, wars rage, kings die, rivers flood. But inside, words endure. Every sound, every deal, every prayer is preserved. Ur is alive, and through writing, it will remain alive long after its walls crumble. The invention of writing did something even more extraordinary. It tied people together across distance. A merchant could send a tablet with a caravan, and days later another merchant, hundreds of miles away, could read his words exactly as he wrote them. Trade expanded. Ideas spread. Writing built invisible roads of thought that crossed deserts and mountains. For the first time, human voices could travel without the body, and so the Sumerians gave the world a tool that would never be lost. Today we may write with pens or type on glowing screens, but the principle is the same. Marks that hold meaning, symbols that carry memory. Every book in every library, every law carved into marble, every letter, every message, they are all children of those first clay tablets. The Sumerians could not have known how far their invention would reach. They could not have imagined airplanes or satellites or printing presses. But perhaps they did understand this, that writing gave them a kind of immortality. Long after their fields turned to dust, their voices would still be heard, and here we are thousands of years later, still listening. We can still hold their tablets in our hands, still read the words they pressed into clay, still feel the urgency of their lives. The Sumerians are gone, their cities buried in sand, their kings forgotten. Yet their words remain, whispering from the clay, reminding us that the human story began here. The rivers had given birth to cities, and those cities had raised temples and crowned kings. But with the Sumerians came something greater still, the birth of the written word, the birth of memory itself. And yet, as writing spread, so did ambition. Kings now had the means to boast of conquests, to command armies with clarity, to bind entire peoples under law. The written word would build empires, but it would also fuel wars. For beyond the quiet scratching of the stylus lay the roar of armies, and the first great empire of history was about to rise. The cities of Sumer flourished, their temples rising higher, their tablets multiplying, their kings boasting of power gifted by the gods. Yet for all their brilliance they remained fragile islands of brick and clay. Each city was its own world, proud, ambitious, and endlessly at war with its neighbors. You fought with Lagash, Lagash with Emma, Kish with Uruk. Water was their lifeline and water was their curse. Whoever controlled the canals controlled survival. And so year after year, armies clashed on the baked plains, bronze blades flashing in the sun, spears rattling like dry reeds in the wind. Out of this chaos came a man who would change history. His name was Sargon, though in time the world would remember him as Sargon the Great. His story begins not in a palace, but in secrecy and shadow. Legend says that as a baby he was placed in a basket of reeds, set afloat upon the river, and rescued by a gardener who raised him as his own. He grew up among the workers, smelling of soil, hearing the prayers of farmers, learning the rhythms of both the land and the city. Perhaps this humble origin gave him something other kings lacked, an understanding of the people who labored beneath the weight of temples and palaces. But Sargon was not destined to remain in the shadows. He rose to serve the king of Kish as a cupbearer, a servant close enough to whisper in the ear of power. Yet ambition burned inside him. He gathered loyal men, hardened by the dust of the plains, and when the moment came, he struck. Sargon seized Kish, and from that victory he built momentum, sweeping across Sumer like a storm. One by one, the proud city-states fell before him. Uruk, Lagash all bent their knee. For the first time in history, the land between the rivers was united under a single ruler. But Sargon's ambition did not stop at the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. With disciplined armies, he marched beyond the borders of Sumer. His soldiers' sandals kicked up the sands of the Syrian desert. Their bronze blades glinted beneath the mountains of Anatolia. They reached as far as the Mediterranean Sea, where waves crashed against rocky shores no Sumerian had ever seen. Sargon had done what no man before him dared. He created an empire, a dominion of many peoples bound by one king's command. Imagine the sight of his capital, Akkad. Though its ruins remain hidden from us today, in its time it must have been a wonder. Markets overflowed with goods from every corner of the known world. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan gleamed blue as the heavens. Timber from distant Lebanon scented the air with cedar. Silver, copper, tin, and grain flowed into Akkad's storerooms. The streets buzzed with voices in many tongues, traders bargaining, in languages that mixed and mingled until the city itself became a living crossroads of civilizations. Yet Sargon knew that conquest alone could not hold an empire together. Force could win battles, but order required loyalty. He appointed governors to rule the conquered cities, loyal men who answered only to him. He placed his trusted daughters as high priestesses in distant temples, binding religion to his dynasty. One of these daughters, Enheduanna, became not only the most powerful priestess of her time, but also the first known poet in human history. In hymns carved into clay, she praised the goddess Inanna, with words so vivid they still echo after 4,000 years. In her voice we hear not only devotion, but also the personal struggle of a woman caught between duty, faith, and power. Her poetry is humanity speaking for the first time in its own eternal voice. Sargon's empire thrived, but it also stirred resentment. The Sumerian cities, proud of their independence, chafed under Akkadian rule. Revolts flared, rebellions sparked like fire in dry grass. Yet Sargon was relentless. For more than 50 years he reigned, and in his lifetime no enemy could bring him down. He stood as the very image of a king chosen by the gods, unyielding, victorious, eternal. But even legends are mortal. After Sargon's death, his empire passed to his sons and grandsons, and with each generation the cracks deepened. The cities of Sumer rose again in defiance. Enemies beyond the rivers tested the borders. The weight of ruling so vast a land pressed down on Akkad like the floodwaters of the Tigris. And then came a force no king could command. Drought. The rains failed. The rivers shrank. Fields withered under a merciless sun. Hungry mouths outnumbered the grain in the storerooms. Desperation drove people to abandon their homes. Cities once filled with life grew silent, their streets coated in dust. The empire that Sargon had built with bronze and blood now trembled under the weight of nature's fury. Out of the north, new enemies arrived. The Deutschans, fierce mountain tribes, swept across Mesopotamia. They raided cities, toppled rulers, and brought ruin in their wake. To the Sumerians, it seemed as if the gods themselves had turned against Akkad. They called the Gutians a curse, a punishment for arrogance, a plague upon the land. In temple hymns, scribes wrote of them as savages who knew nothing of farming, or order who destroyed what they touched and left desolation behind. The empire of Sargon collapsed, its glory fading like the last light of sunset. Akkad, the great capital, disappeared into history, swallowed by time until even its ruins could no longer be found. Only the memory of its greatness lingered in clay tablets, half history, half legend. And yet the dream of empire did not die. For all its fall, the Akkadian experiment left a mark upon the world. Never again would kings be content to rule a single city. The idea of uniting many lands under one throne had been born, and it would never be forgotten. The echo of Sargon's ambition would reach across centuries, inspiring conquerors from Babylon to Persia to Rome. But in the moment of its collapse, Mesopotamia returned to the hands of the Sumerians. The Deutschans ruled for a time, but they were strangers to the land. In the end, the Sumerian kings of yore would rise once more, reclaiming their cities, restoring their temples, and beginning what history remembers as the last great flowering of Sumerian power, the third dynasty of yore. The rivers still flowed. The temples still stood. The clay tablets still bore the words of scribes. And though empires might fall, the idea of civilization endured. The world had seen its first empire, and though it had crumbled, the memory of Sargon's dream became a torch carried forward. When you walk today through the ruins of Mesopotamian cities, when you see the baked bricks marked with the names of long-dead kings, you can almost hear the whispers of that age, the clash of bronze, the chants of priests, the scratching of reeds on clay. You can imagine the pride of a man who once ruled from the mountains to the sea, who believed the gods had chosen him to bind the world together. And yet the story is not one of triumph alone. It is also a warning. The empire rose quickly, but it fell just as quickly, undone by rebellion, by famine, by enemies beyond its control. Power is fragile. Civilization is fragile. The same rivers that gave life could also take it away. Still, from this crucible of ambition and ruin, humanity learned. We learned that cities could be bound into nations, that nations could be forged into empires. We learned that words carved into clay could carry power across time, that memory could outlast even the strongest walls. And above all, we learned that the dream of greatness once kindled never fades. The age of Sargon ended, but a new age was dawning. In the ruins of Akkad, in the shadow of collapse, new rulers would rise, carrying forward the flame of Mesopotamia. Soon another city would rise above them all, a city whose name would ring like thunder through the centuries. Its gardens would be called wonders. Its laws would shape nations. Its tower would climb toward the heavens. Babylon awaited. The collapse of Akkad left Mesopotamia scattered, a broken land of rival cities and shifting powers. For a time the Gushans held sway, but they were outsiders, mountain tribes who ruled with chaos rather than order. Slowly the Sumerian cities reclaimed themselves, rebuilding their temples, restoring their fields, and bringing life back to the land. You arose again with proud kings who tried to restore the old ways, but nothing in Mesopotamia ever stayed still. For long, the land between the rivers was a stage, and on that stage a new city prepared to claim the spotlight. Its name was Babylon. At first, Babylon was no more than a modest town, a settlement like many others. Its walls were not yet high, its temples not yet grand, but its position was powerful. Nestled near the Euphrates, it stood at a crossroads of trade and conquest. Caravans from the north and south, merchants from the east and west, all paths seemed to bend toward it. What Babylon lacked in age and tradition, it made up for in opportunity. And opportunity attracts ambition. In time, a dynasty arose in Babylon that would change the shape of Mesopotamia forever. The most famous of its rulers was Hammurabi, a man whose name still carries weight across millennia. When he first took the throne in the 18th century BCE, Babylon was just one kingdom among many. To the north, rivals in Assyria sharpened their spears. To the south, Elam lurked with hungry eyes. The land was a patchwork quilt of city-states, each clinging to power, each wary of the other. Hammurabi would not accept this patchwork. He had a vision, one as daring as Sargon's had been, to bring all of Mesopotamia under one crown. Hammurabi was not a conqueror in haste. He understood that power is not just taken by force, but woven carefully, thread by thread. He began with diplomacy. He made alliances, signed treaties, played friend and partner. Cities that might have feared him instead welcomed him as an equal. But Hammurabi was patient. He waited for his rivals to weaken, for alliances to fray, for enemies to stumble. And when the moment was right, he struck. His armies marched with discipline, their bronze weapons gleaming, their banners snapping in the wind. One by one the rival kings fell. Hammurabi claimed their cities not just with a sword, but with the promise of stability. Under his rule, irrigation was repaired, canals cleared, trade routes secured. To many, conquest did not feel like chains, but like order restored. By the end of his reign, Hammurabi stood as master of Mesopotamia, from the Persian Gulf to the mountains of the north. Babylon, once a small town, had become the beating heart of a vast kingdom. But Hammurabi's greatness did not rest solely on conquest. What made his reign legendary was his determination to bind his empire with more than fear. He sought to give its structure a foundation that could outlast him, and so he turned to law. Laws had existed before, of course. Kings and councils had long declared punishments and customs. But Hammurabi went further. He gathered the traditions of the land, the rulings of judges, the decrees of rulers, and he carved them into stone, permanent and unyielding. The result was the Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest known legal systems in the world. Picture the scene. In the center of Babylon, a black stone stele rises tall, its surface covered with rows of cuneiform signs carved deep into the rock. At the top, an image shows Hammurabi standing before Shamash, the sun god and god of justice. receiving from him the rod and ring of kingship. The message is clear. The laws below are not merely the words of a man, they are sanctioned by the gods themselves. The laws spoke to every corner of life. If a man stole from another, he must repay. If a builder constructed a house that collapsed and killed its owner, the builder's own life was forfeit. If a son struck his father, his hand would be cut off. If a man put out the eye of another, his own eye would be destroyed. Harsh, yes, but also precise. For the first time, ordinary people could look to a written code and know the rules by which they lived. Justice was no longer hidden in the hearts of kings or priests. It was carved in stone for all to see. The code revealed a world both familiar and alien. It defended the weak, declaring that widows and orphans should be protected. Yet it also divided society sharply, punishing nobles and slaves by different measures. It sought fairness, but fairness through balance, not mercy. To us, the punishments may seem cruel. To them they were order in a world where chaos always lurked. In Babylon itself, life thrived under Hammurabi's hand. The city grew, its markets overflowing with goods. Bakers filled the streets with the scent of fresh bread, while potters shaped clay into jars and bowls, their wheels spinning endlessly. Traders brought spices, metals, and precious stones. Musicians plucked harps and blew flutes in the courtyards of nobles. And above it all rose the temples, the great ziggurats where priests offered sacrifices and whispered prayers for the city's fortune. Babylon was not only a center of power but of culture. Knowledge blossomed. Astronomers studied the skies from temple rooftops, mapping the paths of stars and planets. Doctors recorded remedies on clay tablets, mixing herbs and oils in the hopes of healing the sick. Scribes copied hymns, stories, and proverbs, filling libraries with the wisdom of generations. It was said that in Babylon even the gods took notice, for the city itself seemed touched with their favor. And yet, for all its glory, Babylon under Hammurabi was not free from shadows. War never vanished. Rebellion never slept. Hammurabi's conquests, though brilliant, rested on fragile foundations. After his death, the empire he had built began to fray. Rivals rose again, and Babylon's supremacy was challenged time and time over. But Hammurabi himself had left a mark that could not be erased. His code, his vision of justice, his city's rise, all these endured, echoing through history long after his walls had crumbled. Even today, when we speak of laws, of justice, of fairness between people, we are speaking in Hammurabi's shadow. His stele, carved with cuneiform, still stands in museums, still readable after nearly 4,000 years. His city, though rebuilt and destroyed many times, remains one of the great names of the ancient world. Babylon became a symbol of ambition, power and glory, and in time also of hubris, pride, and downfall. For now, though in Hammurabi's age Babylon stood at its height, a city of power and wonder, a beacon of civilization. But history is never still. Just as the rivers that nourished Mesopotamia could flood and destroy, so too could time sweep away its greatest kings. The story of Mesopotamia would not end here. Beyond Babylon another force stirred in the north, a people of iron and conquest, a people whose armies would march like storms. The Assyrians waited, their gaze fixed on the lands below. ready to carve their own empire from the bones of kings. The rivers still flowed, the fields still bloomed, the temples still rose, but the balance of power had shifted. In the north of Mesopotamia, a new force was awakening, hardened not by the fertile marshes of Sumer, but by a harsher land of rocky hills and wild frontiers. From these rough beginnings emerged the Assyrians, a people who would build an empire not on diplomacy or law, but on the edge of the sword. Their story was one of ambition sharpened into iron, of armies that moved like storms, of kings who believed conquest itself was the will of the gods. At first, Assyria was only a small kingdom, centered on the city of Ashur, perched on the banks of the river Tigris. The city was named for its god, Ashur, who was more than a protector, he was destiny itself. To the Assyrians, Ashur demanded not just worship but expansion. To spread the borders of Assyria was to fulfill his divine will. And so, unlike the city-states of Sumer, who fought for water, or the kings of Babylon who built codes of law, the Assyrians turned their entire society into a machine of war. Their armies became the terror of the ancient world. Picture it, a column of soldiers marching across the horizon, their shields locked, their iron swords gleaming. Chariots rumble like thunder across the plains, their wheels tearing the earth, their archers unleashing storms of arrows. Behind them march engineers, carrying ladders, battering rams, and siege engine stools designed to smash the walls of any city foolish enough to resist. And above all, the banners of Ashur flutter, carried proudly as symbols of divine conquest. Unlike the armies of earlier kings, the Assyrians did not melt away after victory. They planted their flag and held their ground. Cities that resisted them were punished with unimaginable cruelty. Walls were torn down, fields burned, people slaughtered or dragged into exile. Tales spread of Assyrian kings flaying rebels alive, of heads piled in pyramids, of captives chained and paraded through the streets. Whether these stories were truth or propaganda, they served their purpose: terror. For the Assyrians understood that fear was as powerful a weapon as any sword, and yet, for all their brutality, they were also brilliant. Their empire was not chaos, it was meticulously organized. Roads were built across their lands, lined with posts to carry messages swiftly, from one end of the kingdom to the other. Governors were placed in conquered cities, reporting directly to the king. Massive palaces rose in cities like Nineveh and Nimrud, decorated with carved stone reliefs that showed the king hunting lions, leading armies, standing tall above defeated enemies. These reliefs were not mere art. They were propaganda carved into stone, a reminder that the king was both warrior and master of the natural world. One of the greatest of these kings was Ashurnasirpal II. He boasted of campaigns that left rivers choked with corpses and fields littered with bodies, but he also rebuilt cities, filled them with wealth, and decorated his palace with dazzling art. He invited nobles from across the empire to a grand banquet in his new capital, feeding them with food and drink in quantities so immense that the celebration lasted days. In his rule, terror and magnificence walked hand in hand. But it was under Tiglath-Pileser III and those who followed him that Assyria reached new heights. They reformed the army into a permanent, professional force, no longer farmers called to battle for a season, but soldiers who lived and trained as warriors year-round. They mastered the art of siege warfare, dragging massive engines to the gates of cities, pounding walls until they crumbled. They forged weapons from iron, stronger and deadlier than the bronze blades of their enemies. With these tools, the Assyrians carved an empire stretching from the mountains of Anatolia to the sands of Egypt. Imagine the reach of such a kingdom. In the markets of Nineveh, merchants bartered goods from every corner of the known world. Ivory, carvings from Africa, spices from Arabia, timber from Lebanon, silver from the mountains. The wealth of nations poured into Assyria's coffers, tribute paid by kings who dared not defy them. In their libraries, scribes copied texts from conquered lands, preserving myths, histories, and sciences. In their palaces, kings reclined on couches, sipping wine as musicians played, while outside their walls, thousands of captives labored to keep the empire alive. Yet the heart of Assyria remained war. Their kings defined themselves not by peace but by conquest. Each campaign was recorded in vivid detail on clay tablets and carved into palace walls. Every enemy defeated, every city captured, every tribute taken. These were the achievements. Mattered. Peace was not the absence of war, but the pause between campaigns. But empire is a double-edged sword. The same conquests that filled Assyria with wealth also filled it with enemies. Entire nations remembered the burnings, the exiles, the cruelty. And while fear could crush rebellion, it could never erase hatred. Beneath the surface of Assyrian glory, resentment smoldered like coals waiting for a spark. The kings themselves sensed this, and so they built ever grander monuments to prove their power. Sennacherib, one of Assyria's most famous rulers, made Nineveh a jewel of the world. He built massive walls, broad avenues, lush gardens watered by aqueducts, and a palace so vast he called it the palace without rival. On its walls, reliefs showed his victories, including the siege of Lachish in Judah, where his armies overwhelmed defenders and dragged captives into exile. For Sennacherib, art was memory, and memory was power. Yet even he could not escape the cycle of violence. Rebellion plagued his reign, and though he crushed his enemies with brutal efficiency, his own sons turned against him. He was murdered in the very temple of his god, struck down not by foreign enemies but by his own blood. Even in the heart of power, the knife of ambition could find its mark. Assyria endured, carried forward by kings like Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal. Esarhaddon rebuilt Babylon after his father had destroyed it, understanding that ruling through reconciliation could sometimes win more than terror. Ashurbanipal, remembered as the last great Assyrian king, was a conqueror and a scholar. In Nineveh, he built a library filled with tens of thousands of tablets, hymns, myths, laws, medical texts, even the epic of Gilgamesh itself. Thanks to him, the words of Mesopotamia survived the fall of its cities. His library became a bridge between the ancient world and ours, a treasure trove of memory buried in the sands until rediscovered thousands of years later. But no empire, no matter how mighty, is eternal. The Assyrians had stretched their reach too far, demanded too much from the peoples they ruled, spilled too much blood across too many lands. Enemies united against them, Babylonians to the south, Medes to the east, and countless others who longed for revenge. In the late 7th century BCE, their cities burned. Nineveh itself was sacked, its palaces looted, its walls toppled. The great empire that had once struck terror into the world was reduced to ash. The fall of Assyria was greeted with cheers by those who had suffered under its rule. To them it was justice, the gods' revenge on kings who had gone too far. Yet even in its destruction, Assyria left behind a legacy impossible to erase. Their armies had reshaped the map. Their palaces had set new standards of grandeur. Their libraries had preserved the stories of the world, and their memory, both feared and admired, would echo through history. When the dust of Nineveh settled, power once again shifted south. Babylon, rebuilt and resurgent, prepared to rise as the next great master of Mesopotamia, and this time it would reach heights of wonder and beauty that the world would remember forever. Its hanging gardens would be called one of the wonders of the world. Its walls would stretch like mountains across the horizon, and its name would become legend. Assyria's roar had faded, but Babylon's song was about to begin. The roar of Assyria faded into silence, its palaces blackened ruins, its mighty armies scattered. From the ashes of Nineveh, a new master rose, one whose name would become legend, one whose city would shine like a jewel in the desert. Babylon, long a center of culture and trade, stepped forward into the spotlight once more, and under the hand of kings like Nebuchadnezzar, it reached a glory so dazzling that even its enemies could not forget it. Babylon had always carried weight, its name whispered with awe across the ancient world. But now it grew into something more, a city so vast, so magnificent, that travelers swore its walls touched the heavens. Imagine approaching it from the plains. At first you see the shimmer of heat above the horizon, then rising slowly into view, colossal walls of sun-baked brick stretch across the earth, their sheer size staggering. Some said they were wide enough to race chariots upon, tall enough to block the sun. Gates of bronze glinted, guarded by colossal figures of lions and dragons. Beyond them, towers and temples rose, their summits glowing red in the evening light. Babylon was not merely a city. It was a statement. Here is power, here is majesty, here is the center of the world. At its heart towered the great ziggurat, a stepped mountain of brick and stone, known in later legend as the Tower of Babel. Priests climbed its terraces carrying offerings, believing that at its summit they could bridge the distance between heaven and earth. Smoke of sacrifice curled upward into the sky, while chants echoed down its stairways. This was the sacred spine of the city, tying mortal lives to the eternal gods. And yet Babylon was not only the city of temples, it was also the city of gardens. Ancient writers spoke of a wonder unlike any other, a marvel of greenery in the midst of desert heat, the hanging gardens. Imagine yourself walking through them. Terraces rise like layers of paradise, each overflowing with trees, vines, and flowers. Water flows down from hidden channels, glistening as it spills across leaves and petals. The scent of jasmine and cedar fills the air. Birds flutter among branches, their songs mingling with the sound of trickling streams. It is said Nebuchadnezzar built these gardens for his queen, who longed for the mountains of her homeland. Whether the gardens truly existed or whether they were only legend, they captured imaginations for centuries, a symbol of human ingenuity, of beauty wrestled from barren soil. Nebuchadnezzar himself was a figure both feared and admired. To his people, he was a builder king, a restorer of glory, a man chosen by Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. To his enemies he was a conqueror whose armies could not be resisted. His reign stretched Babylon's reach across the Near East, from the deserts of Arabia to the lands of Judah. When Jerusalem defied him, his soldiers broke its walls, burned its temple, and carried its people into exile. Among those captives were the voices that would later shape the Hebrew Bible, voices that remembered Babylon not only for its wonders but also as a place of sorrow, a city of exile. In their writings, Babylon became a symbol of pride and punishment, of glory mixed with sin. Inside Babylon's walls, however, life thrived. The streets bustled with traders and craftsmen. Markets overflowed with spices, dates, wool, and copper. Artisans carved intricate statues, hammered golden jewelry, painted vibrant mosaics. Musicians played harps and flutes in the courtyards, while dancers twirled in festivals dedicated to the gods. The air carried the scents of roasted lamb, of baking bread, of incense burning in shrines. At night, oil lamps flickered in windows, casting the city in a golden glow. It was a place alive with color, sound, and movement, a place where the pulse of humanity beat strong. The rulers of Babylon were not content with beauty alone. They understood that power required more than temples and gardens. Nebuchadnezzar strengthened the city's defenses, rebuilding its walls, constructing new fortresses, ensuring that no enemy could breach its gates. He commissioned inscriptions declaring his works, boasting of how he had made Babylon a city without equal. And to many who saw it, this was no exaggeration. For a brief, dazzling moment, Babylon truly stood as the center of the world. But the brilliance of Babylon carried shadows as well. Its grandeur was built on the backs of countless laborers, many of them captives from conquered lands. Its glory was funded by tribute and plunder, wealth wrung from the toil of others. And though its gods promised protection, time and fate had already proven that no city, no matter how mighty, could escape decline. For even as Babylon reached its peak, forces stirred beyond its horizons that would one day bring it low. Still, in this golden age it seemed eternal. Astronomers studied the skies from Babylon's towers, mapping constellations, predicting eclipses, laying the foundations of science that would echo into Greece and beyond. Scholars recorded medical remedies, mathematical tables, hymns, and histories on clay tablets that survive to this day. In their libraries, the knowledge of centuries was gathered, ensuring that Babylon was not just a city of brick, but a city of wisdom. And yet the most powerful legacy of Babylon was not its walls, nor its gardens, nor its temples, but its image. To those who lived there, it was paradise, a city blessed by the gods. To those carried there in chains, it was a city of exile, a place of sorrow. To later generations, it became the symbol of human ambition and pride, a name that would echo through myths, religions, and stories long after its bricks had crumbled. Walk its streets in your imagination. Hear the cries of vendors in the market. Smell the spices drifting from stalls. Feel the sun beating on the stones beneath your feet. Look up at the towering ziggurat, its peak lost in clouds. Glimpse the glistening terraces of the hanging gardens, vines trailing down like rivers of green. See the soldiers marching in bronze helmets, their spears upright, their banners waving in the desert wind. And hear, above all, the voice of the king, declaring that Babylon is eternal, but history whispers differently. Cities rise and cities fall. The rivers that fed Babylon would one day flood and change course. The walls that seemed unbreakable would one day be breached. The people who believed their city immortal would one day see it conquered. For beyond the horizon, new powers gathered, powers that would test Babylon's might. Persia, vast and hungry, cast its eyes westward. Its kings would look upon Babylon, not with awe, but with ambition. Still, in this moment, Babylon stood unrivaled. Its gardens shimmered, its temples towered, its streets thrummed with life. It was the jewel of Mesopotamia, the wonder of the world, the city whose very name meant greatness. To live in Babylon was to stand at the heart of history, at the center of everything known. To speak of Babylon was to speak of majesty itself, and though its glory would one day fade, though its bricks would crumble into dust, though its name would become a symbol of pride and fall, it had already achieved immortality. For Babylon was not only a city of earth and stone, it was a city of myth, a city that even now, across thousands of years, still glows in our imagination like a flame that refuses to die. The story of Mesopotamia was not finished, for the wheel of history kept turning. As Babylon reached its heights, shadows gathered. Once more, kings of Persia sharpened their blades, their empire growing like a tide that no wall could resist. The rivers that had given birth to the world's first cities would soon bear witness to yet another conquest, another chapter, another rise and fall, and the name of Babylon, glorious and cursed, would echo into eternity. The glory of Babylon shone like the desert sun, dazzling, immense, and seemingly eternal. Yet nothing built by human hands can escape the pull of time. Behind its colossal walls, life went on, priests climbing the ziggurat with offerings, merchants calling out in the bustling markets, scribes pressing clay tablets with records of trade, astronomers mapping the heavens from temple roofs. But beyond those walls, beyond the familiar sweep of the Euphrates, a new power stirred, gathering strength with every passing season. To the east, across mountains and plateaus, Persia was rising, and its kings dreamed not only of ruling their homeland, but of uniting the world beneath their banner. Cyrus, whom history would remember as Cyrus the Great, was unlike many conquerors. Before him, born into the Achaemenid dynasty, he inherited a modest realm among the Persians. Yet from the moment he took command, he showed a gift that set him apart, the ability to combine vision with mercy, ambition with wisdom. He defeated powerful neighbors one after another, weaving their lands into his growing empire. He conquered Media, toppled Lydia, and stretched his rule farther than any before him. His eyes then turned toward the jewel of Mesopotamia, the city, whose name had become synonymous with wonder and power. Babylon was his next prize. The city was not unaware of the Persian threat. Its rulers, proud and stubborn, trusted in their walls, their gods, and their legacy. Babylon had survived Assyrians, Elamites, floods, and famine. Surely it could withstand Cyrus, but power often falters not from the strength of enemies, but from weakness within. The Babylonian king Nabonidus was unpopular, more devoted to his religious reforms than to the heart of his people. He angered the priesthood of Marduk, Babylon's chief god, by elevating other deities above him. Discontent simmered. Cyrus, ever shrewd, saw not just a fortress to conquer, but a city already restless, waiting for a change. The Persian army approached like a tide, vast and disciplined. Babylon prepared for siege, confident that its walls, so thick, so tall, were unbreachable. Legend said chariots could race along their tops, that no ladder could scale them, that no ram could shatter their gates. Within the city, the people watched, anxious yet assured, trusting that their walls would hold as they always had. But Cyrus did not rely on brute force alone. He turned to cunning. The Euphrates River flowed through Babylon, splitting the city in two, its waters channeled by gates and defenses. To the Babylonians, the river was life itself, feeding their fields, sustaining their homes, running through the heart of their great city. To Cyrus, it was the key. His soldiers worked upstream, digging canals, diverting the water, until the riverbed that cut through Babylon ran shallow. One night, under cover of darkness, his troops waded into the city through the emptied riverbed, slipping beneath the gates that were meant to guard against the current, but not against men. By dawn, Babylon had fallen dot. It is said the city barely fought. The priests of Marduk welcomed Cyrus, seeing in him a liberator from Nabonidus's neglect. The people, weary of their king, accepted the Persians as rulers. And Cyrus, true to his nature, did not sack Babylon. He did not burn its temples or slaughter its inhabitants. Instead, he entered as though chosen by the gods themselves. He ordered the restoration of Marduk's cult, returned images of deities to their shrines, and declared freedom for peoples held captive within Babylon's reach. The most famous of these exiles were the Jews, carried into Babylon decades earlier after Jerusalem's destruction. Cyrus allowed them to return to their homeland, to rebuild their temple, to worship their God in peace. To them he became a figure of deliverance, remembered in their scriptures as chosen by the divine. With Cyrus's entry, the age of Babylon as a sovereign power ended. The city did not vanish. Its walls still towered, its gardens still bloomed, its markets still thrived. But it was no longer the center of an empire. Instead, it became a jewel in a far larger crown, the Persian Empire, a realm that stretched from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean Sea, from the mountains of Central Asia to the deserts of Egypt. Babylon, once the master of nations, was now one city among many, absorbed into a vision grander than its own. And yet, even under Persian rule, Babylon retained its aura. It remained a place of wisdom, of learning, of awe. The Persians themselves respected its traditions, using it as a capital for administration, honoring its gods, employing its scribes and scholars. The city was too great to simply fade. It continued to pulse with life, a reminder that though crowns may change, culture endures. Still, for the proud, the fall of Babylon was a wound. To the Hebrews, it became a symbol of arrogance brought low, of human pride humbled by the will of greater powers. To later generations, it would stand as a warning, a name spoken not only with admiration, but with dread. Babylon became more than a city. It became an idea, a word that carried with it the weight of glory and the certainty of downfall. Cyrus had not lived forever. He died on campaign, still chasing new horizons, still dreaming of a world united. But the empire he built endured, carried forward by his heirs. Darius, who followed, expanded its borders even farther, ruling through a system of satraps, governors, who watched over provinces with efficiency. Roads stretched across the empire, linking cities with speed. Couriers raced along them, carrying messages that could travel hundreds of miles in days. Trade flourished, cultures blended, and for a time, a vast peace settled over lands once fractured by endless war. In this new order, Babylon remained important, but it was no longer the heartbeat of the world. Its gardens, if they truly stood, may have withered. Its ziggurat still loomed, but no longer as a symbol of unchallenged dominance. The torch had passed to Persia, and though Babylon remained a glowing ember, it was no longer the flame, and yet the memory of its fall lingered like smoke. For centuries, poets, prophets, and storytellers returned to that night when the riverbed lay dry and the gates swung open. To them, Babylon's fall was not just the end of a city, but a parable about the fragility of power. No matter how high the walls, no matter how strong the kings, no matter how brilliant the gardens, all could be undone in a single night. Walk through Babylon and your imagination after Cyrus's conquest. The markets still hum, the temples still rise, the river still flows. Children laugh in the streets, priests chant in the sanctuaries, merchants trade their wares. Life goes on as it always does. But somewhere in the whispers of the people there is a shift. Babylon is no longer the center of the world. Its pride has been pierced. Its crown has been taken. And though its body lives, its soul has already begun to fade. The story of Mesopotamia was nearing its twilight. The land between the rivers had given birth to cities, to kings, to gods, to writing, to law, to empire. It had seen Sumer, Akkad, Assyria, Babylon rise and fall, like the floodwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates. And now, under Persia, it became part of a larger world, its brilliance folded into a tapestry that stretched beyond anything its first builders could have imagined. But history has a way of circling back, of carrying forward echoes from the past. Though Babylon would never again rule the earth, its name would endure as a symbol, whispered in stories, carved in scripture, painted in prophecy. Its fall would be remembered not as the end of one city, but as the reminder that even the mightiest are mortal. And as Persia rose in triumph, the ruins of future centuries were already written in the dust. The empire of Persia stretched wide, its roads carrying messengers faster than the wind, its palaces echoing with the voices of kings who commanded nations. Babylon, though conquered, remained a jewel within this crown, still alive with its markets, its temples, its scholars. Yet even as it pulsed with life, time was changing, and the world beyond its walls was stirring. Mesopotamia, the land that had birthed civilization, was now but one province among many, part of a kingdom so vast that its name no longer carried the same fear, the same pride. Persian kings ruled with skill, weaving together cultures under their banner. Darius built Persepolis, a city of stone and fire, where envoys from every corner of the empire brought gifts: gold from Lydia, ivory from India, wine from Greece, lapis from Mesopotamia. He organized the empire with precision, dividing it into provinces, each with governors who answered to him. The rivers of Mesopotamia became part of this vast system, their grain flowing outward, their wealth filling Persian coffers. But while Mesopotamia remained important, it was no longer unique. Its brilliance was fading into the background of a larger world. The people of the rivers still lived their lives. Farmers rose at dawn, guiding plows drawn by oxen across the fertile soil. Merchants still loaded boats with dates and wool, floating them down the Euphrates. Priests still chanted hymns in shadowed temples, their incense rising toward gods who had watched over them since the dawn of time. But something was different. Once their cities had been the center of everything, the first to build, the first to write, the first to rule. Now they were remembered as ancient, their glory belonging to the past rather than the present. Whispers came from the west of restless new powers. Greece, a land of mountains and seas, had begun to stir. Its people, divided into city-states, fought among themselves, yet shared a culture fierce and ambitious. When Persia reached across the Aegean, hoping to bring Greece under its sway, it met resistance. At Marathon, at Salamis, at Plataea, the Greeks stood firm. The empire of Persia, mighty though it was, found its limits. And in that resistance, a spark was lit that would one day blaze across the world. For now, Mesopotamia remained Persian, its cities watched by satraps, its people taxed, its gods honored, but no longer supreme. Yet within this seeming calm, cracks widened. Empires do not last forever, no matter how wide their roads, no matter how swift their armies. And when Persia weakened, the Greeks, united at last under one name, would come. Alexander was his name, a young king of Macedon, born far from the Euphrates, yet destined to leave his mark upon it. His father Philip had forged the Greeks into one force, and when Philip fell, Alexander carried that force farther than anyone dreamed. He marched east with an army small compared to Persia's numbers, yet swift, disciplined, and filled with fire. At Issus, at Gaugamela, he struck, and the great Persian hosts fell before him. Darius fled, the empire cracked, and in the wake of Alexander's advance, Mesopotamia once again became a battlefield. Imagine the moment his soldiers approached Babylon. The city still stood proud, its walls rising in the sun, its towers shimmering with color. But this time there was no desperate resistance. Babylon opened its gates to him, welcoming him not as conqueror, but as king. Priests offered him homage in the name of Marduk, the old god who had seen so many kings come and go. Alexander walked its streets, gazed at its gardens, marveled at its ziggurat. For him, Babylon was more than a city. It was a symbol of everything that came before, the cradle of civilization, the heart of the world he was trying to unite. He dreamed of making it his capital, the center of a new empire stretching from Greece to India. He envisioned Babylon not as the fallen city of old Thales, but as the foundation of something eternal. Yet fate is cruel. Alexander, still young, still filled with plans, fell ill within its walls. Some say fever struck him, others whisper poison. But whatever the cause, the conqueror who had crossed deserts and mountains, who had shattered Persia, who had dreamed of ruling the earth, died in Babylon at the age of 32. His empire, too vast to hold together, fractured among his generals. His dream of Babylon as the heart of the world faded into dust in the centuries that followed. Mesopotamia passed from hand to hand. Seleucid Greeks ruled it, founding new cities like Seleucia on the Tigris, blending Greek and Mesopotamian ways. Later came the Parthians, horse lords from the east, who held it for generations. Then the Romans reached its edges, fighting the Parthians for control, their legions clashing on the plains where Sumerian farmers once planted their barley. Later still came the Sassanids, Persians once again, carrying fire altars, and worshipping Ahura Mazda, seeking to restore the old grandeur of Persia. Through it all, the rivers flowed, indifferent to kings. Farmers still bent over their fields. Children still played in the dust. Traders still crossed the markets. The gods of Sumer, Akkad, Assyria, Babylon slowly faded, replaced by new faiths, new temples, new prayers. And yet, beneath every stone, beneath every ruined ziggurat, the memory of the old world remained dot by the time new religions spread. Judaism from the exiles who had once wept by the rivers of Babylon, Christianity carried by missionaries, Islam. Sweeping across deserts centuries later, the ancient gods were silent. Their temples crumbled, their names carved in clay tablets, buried deep in the earth. But their influence had not vanished. The laws of Hammurabi, the myths of Gilgamesh, the ziggurats that had inspired towers of legend, the writing pressed into clay that became the ancestor of every alphabet, all of it lived on, carried forward, in ways the people themselves could never have imagined. Today, when archaeologists brush sand from a tablet, when scholars decipher the wedge-shaped signs of cuneiform, they are hearing voices across thousands of years. Voices of farmers noting their grain, priests singing hymns to Inanna, kings boasting of battles. They are the voices of people who lived, loved, feared, and dreamed, just as we do now. Mesopotamia may have fallen, its cities reduced to ruins, but its story is eternal. Imagine standing now among the ruins of Ur or Uruk or Babylon. The wind whistles through broken walls, carrying dust that once formed bricks raised to the gods. The sun sets over empty plains where once thousands gathered in markets. Silence reigns where once armies marched and kings spoke. Yet if you close your eyes, you can still hear it, the sound of the rivers, the chants of priests, the hammering of builders, the scratch of stylus on clay, the echoes of the first cities, the first empires, the first dreams. The land between the rivers gave you civilization. It gave us kings and laws, myths and writing, temples and towers. It gave us our first taste of glory and our first lessons in downfall. Every empire that followed Persia, Greece, Rome walked in the shadow of Mesopotamia, whether they knew it or not. Its memory shaped them, just as it shapes us still. And though the rivers have shifted, though the land has changed, though the gods are silent and the ziggurats crumble, the story endures. For the story of Mesopotamia is the story of us all, the story of humanity's first steps into greatness, the story of how rivers shaped the first cities, and how those cities gave birth to the world we know. The rivers that once carved life into the desert still flow, though their courses have shifted, and their floods no longer dictate the fate of empires. The cities that once towered above the plains lie in ruins, their bricks broken, their ziggurats flattened into mounds of earth. The names of their kings, once spoken with awe, are now scratched into clay, buried beneath centuries of dust. And yet the story of Mesopotamia did not end with its walls. It never could, for its legacy flows through time like the rivers themselves, winding, bending, disappearing, and reappearing, feeding every civilization that followed. Think of the simplest act, writing a word, signing a name, recording a thought. That act was born in the land between the rivers. Sumerian scribes pressing stylus into clay began a revolution so profound that it still shapes every moment of our lives. Without them there would be no books, no contracts, no laws preserved across centuries. Every letter we trace, every sentence we read, is a descendant of those first wedge-shaped marks. Their clay tablets were fragile, yet their idea was indestructible. Or, think of law, the attempt to bind human chaos with rules. Hammurabi's code may seem harsh to us, its punishments fierce, but it carried a principle that still lives, the idea that law should be written, visible, and enduring. No longer left to the whim of rulers, justice became something greater, something carved in stone. Our courts, our constitutions, our sense of fairness all trace their lineage. Back to that black stele standing in the heart of Babylon. The myths of Mesopotamia echo too. The epic of Gilgamesh, pressed into clay 4,000 years ago, still speaks to us with haunting power. A king's search for immortality, his grief for a lost friend, his realization that no man can escape death, these are themes as human now as they were then. When we read his words, we are not just reading an old story. We are listening to a voice across the gulf of time, reminding us that fear, hope, love, and loss have always been part of the human condition. Their gods, though no longer worshipped, linger in our memory. Inanna, goddess of love and war. Enlil, lord of the air. Marduk, champion of Babylon. They may have faded from temples, but their shadows live in myths that traveled outward, reshaped and retold. Flood stories that echo in Genesis, towers that whisper of Babel, visions of Babylon, as pride and downfall in Scripture, all of them carry the fingerprints of Mesopotamia. Through religion and story, the ancient world still whispers in ours. Even their science, their watching of the heavens still matters. From temple rooftops, priests mapped the stars, charted the movements of the moon, predicted eclipses. Their efforts laid the foundations of astronomy. They divided the circle into 360 degrees, the hour into 60 minutes, the minute into 60 seconds. Every time we look at a clock, every time we measure time itself, we are using the mathematics of Mesopotamia. Their numbers tick on in the Kon. Seconds of our lives dot and their cities, though ruins now gave us the very idea of what a city is. Walls and markets, temples and palaces, the gathering of thousands into one place bound by law and order. The pulse of urban life began there. When we walk through the streets of modern cities with their towers of steel and glass, we are walking in the shadow of Uruk, your Babylon. The hum of traffic, the murmur of crowds, the reaching upward of buildings, all of it echoes the first. Leap humanity took from village to metropolis. Mesopotamia also gave us lessons, bitter but eternal, about the fragility of power. Akkad rose only to vanish in drought and invasion. Assyria ruled with iron, only to be consumed by hatred and rebellion. Babylon shone with beauty, only to fall in a single night to the cunning of Cyrus. Each empire believed itself eternal. Each built walls to outlast time. Each thought its gods would protect it. But the rivers taught otherwise. They gave life, but they also destroyed. And in their floods we see the truth. No empire lasts forever. That lesson has echoed across history, humbling Rome, Byzantium, and countless others. It whispers even now in the corridors of modern power. Walk today among their ruins, and you feel that truth. In the great ziggurat still rises, though worn. By centuries, its stairways leading nowhere. In Nineveh, Carved stones of lion hunts and battles lie shattered, the palaces of mighty kings now silent. In Babylon the remnants of walls stretch across the plain, broken yet still carrying the weight of legend. To stand there is to feel both the greatness of what humanity achieved and the inevitability of its passing. Dust covers bricks, but memory endures. The legacy of Mesopotamia is not only in what they created, but in what they dreamed. They dreamed of touching the heavens with their towers. They dreamed of eternity through their stories. They dreamed of justice through their laws. They dreamed of order in chaos, of permanence in a fleeting world. And though their cities fell, their dreams did not. They became ours. When we speak of civilization, we are speaking of them. When we marvel at human creativity, we are marveling at their spark. When we struggle with pride, ambition, mortality, and the fragility of power, we are struggling with lessons first learned on the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. Mesopotamia is not gone. It lives in our books, our laws, our myths, our clocks, our cities, our imaginations. Close your eyes and picture it one last time. The rivers winding like silver through the desert, the fields green with barley, the first city walls rising from the plain, the ziggurat glowing red in the setting sun, priests chanting in smoky temples, merchants haggling in crowded markets, kings boasting on carved tablets, scribes scratching symbols into wet clay, children laughing by the river, life beginning, fragile and yet unstoppable. The cradle of civilization rocking humanity into its first dawn. The people of Mesopotamia are gone, but their story is our story. Theirs was the first chapter in the book of civilization, and every page written since has carried their mark. And so, though the rivers have shifted, though the bricks have crumbled, though the gods have fallen silent, Mesopotamia endures. It endures not as ruins, not as dust, but as the memory that we, humanity, are capable of greatness, and that every step we take into the future is built upon the footprints they left in the mud so many thousands of years ago.